Let's go ahead and dive into our third section, which is quite a bit smaller, only about 10 to 15% of the exam objectives. Implement access management for apps. Now, even though it's a little bit smaller, this may not be our forte, so you got to weigh that out, what you know versus what you don't know versus the proportion of each exam area. App consent policies describe conditions which must exist before an app can be consented to. These policies may include conditions on the app requesting access as well as the permissions the app is requesting. By choosing which app consent policies apply for all users, you can set limits on when end users are allowed to grant consent to apps and when they will be required to request administrators' review and approval. Disable user consent. Users with this option can continue to sign into apps that have previously consented to or which are consented by administrators. The option users consent to apps from verified publishers on your organization, but only for permissions to select. In this case, all users can only consent to apps that were published by a verified publisher and apps that are registered in the tenant. Another setting, users can consent to all apps, which allows all users to consent to any permission, which doesn't require admin consent for any application. Another option is consent app consent policy. For even more options over the conditions governing when user consent, you can create custom app consent policies and configure those to apply for user consent. Note that risk-based step-up consent helps reduce user exposure to malicious apps that make illicit consent requests. If Microsoft detects a risky end-user consent request, the request will require a step up to admin consent instead. And this capability is enabled by default, but it will only result in a behavior change when an end-user consent is enabled. When a risky consent request is detected, the consent prompt will display a message indicating that admin approval is needed. If the admin consent request workflow is enabled, the users can send the request to an admin for further review directly from the consent prompt. You can use the Azure Active Directory PowerShell Preview module, Azure AD Preview, to disable the step-up to admin consent required in cases where Microsoft detects risks or to re-enable it if it was previously disabled. Microsoft Cloud App Security, or MCAS, is a comprehensive cross-SaaS solution bringing deep visibility, strong data controls, and enhanced threat protection to your cloud apps. Cloud Discovery is one feature of Cloud App Security which enables you to gain visibility into shadow IT by discovering cloud apps in use by others in your organization. The ADFS Application Activity Report in the Azure portal lets you quickly identify which of your applications are capable of being migrated to Azure Active Directory. It assesses all ADFS applications for the compatibility with Azure AD, checks for any issues, and gives guidance on preparing individual applications for migration. With the ADFS Application Activity Report, you can discover ADFS applications and scope your migration, prioritize applications for migration, and then run migration tests and fix issues. The ADFS application activity data is available to users who are assigned any of these admin roles: Global Admin, Report Reader, Security Reader, Application Administrator, or Cloud Application Administrator. Azure AD supports extensive access management for configured applications, enabling organizations to easily achieve the right access policy, ranging from automatic attribute-based assignment through delegation and including administrator management. Azure AD's application assignment focuses on two primary assignment modes. One, individual assignment. An IT admin with Directory Global permissions can select individual user accounts and grant them access to the application. Or two, group-based assignment, which requires an Azure Active Directory P1 or P2 license. Monitor apps through reports that use security incident and event monitoring or SIEM tools such as Azure Sentinel. You can access the reports from the portal or from APIs. Programmatically audit who has access to your applications and remove access to inactive users via access reviews. Azure Active Directory's application proxy provides secure remote access to on-premises web applications. After a single sign-on to Azure AD, users can access both cloud and on-premises applications through an external URL or through an internal application portal. Application Proxy works with web applications that use IWA or Integrated Windows Authentication. Web applications use form-based or header-based access. Web APIs that you want to expose to rich applications on different devices. Applications hosted behind a remote desktop gateway. Or rich client apps that are integrated with MSAL or Microsoft Authentication Library. If you've never implemented this before, make sure you take a look at the tutorial walkthrough on how to set up Azure AD App Proxy. For apps that are built within your company, your developers can use the Microsoft Identity Platform to implement authentication and authorizations. Applications integrated with the platform must be registered with Azure AD and managed just like any other app in your portfolio. Developers can use the platform for both internal use apps and customer-facing apps, and there are other benefits that come with using the platform. MSAL, which is part of the platform, allows developers to enable modern experiences like multi-factor authentication and the use of security keys to access their apps without needing to implement it themselves. Additionally, apps integrated with the Microsoft Identity Platform can access the Microsoft Graph, which is a unified API endpoint providing the M365 data that describes the patterns of productivity, identity, and security in an organization. You can publish your app in the Azure AD App Gallery. When your app is published, it will show up as an option for customers when they are adding apps to their tenant. There are 6 steps that you should review in publishing your app to the Azure AD App Gallery. 1, choose the right single sign-on standard for your app, which the choices are Open Authentication 2.0 or OAuth with OpenID Connect or OIDC, Security Assertion Markup Language or SAML, or Web Services Federation WSFed. 2, implement single sign-on in your app. For OpenID Connect, the application must be multi-tenanted and the Azure AD Consent Framework must be properly implemented for the application. An optional step is to use SCIM provisioning, but highly recommended in building an application. Supporting this SCIM standard is easy to do and allows user accounts to be automatically created and updated in the app without relying on manual processes such as uploading CSV files. 3, create an Azure AD tenant and test your app. Note that an Azure AD tenant comes with every M365 subscription, so that may already exist. Step 4, create and publish documentation to ease user adoption. Step 5, after testing that the application integration works with Azure AD, submit an application request in the Microsoft Application Network portal, which you see on the screen. And 6, you can join the Microsoft Partner Network to provide instant access to exclusive resources, programs, tools, and connections. Azure Active Directory Automatic User Provisioning simplifies the user provisioning process by securely automating the creation, maintenance, and removal of user identities in SaaS applications based on business rules. To address these challenges, the SCIM specification provides a common user schema to help users move into, out of, and around apps. SCIM is becoming the de facto standard for provisioning, and when used in conjunction with federation standards like SAML or OpenID Connect, provides administrators an end-to-end standards-based solution for access management. Applications can sign in users themselves or delegate sign-in to an identity provider. For an identity provider to know that a user has access to a particular app, both the user and the application must be registered with the identity provider. When you register your application with Azure Active Directory, you're providing an identity configuration for your application that allows it to integrate with the Microsoft Identity Platform. After the app is registered, it's given a unique identifier that it shares with the Microsoft Identity Platform when it requests tokens. If the app is a confidential client application, it will also share the secret or public key depending on whether certificates or secrets were used. Consent is the process of a resource owner granting authorization for a client application to access protected resources under specific permissions on behalf of the resource owner. The process of authenticating a user or retrieving authorization to call an API can require multiple steps in Microsoft Identity. Each step adds a dependency on the resource that provides that service. The best experience for the user, and the one with the least dependencies, is to attempt to acquire a token silently to avoid the extra steps before requesting user interaction. There are a few ways for an application to get authorization information. Each method has their advantages and disadvantages. Make sure to review the link to compare between using tokens, Microsoft Graph, or an authentication broker like Microsoft Authenticator on mobile devices. Your application may have multiple tiers, each represented by its own registration in Azure Active Directory. For example, a native application that calls a web API or a web application that calls a web API. In both of these cases, the client requests permissions to call the resource. For the client to be successfully consented into a customer's tenant, all resources to which it requests permissions must already exist in the customer's tenant. If this condition is not met, Azure AD returns an error that the resource must be added first. This can be a problem if your logical application consists of two or more application registrations, for example, a separate client and resource. How do you get these resources into the customer tenant first? Azure AD covers this case by enabling client and resources to be consented in a single step. The user sees the sum total of permissions requested by both the client and resource on the consent page. To enable this behavior, the resource's application registration must include the client ID app known as Known Client Applications in its application manifest.